On behalf of the Center for Jewish Studies at Arizona State University, it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening to the second of a three-part webinar series on Jewish Studies today. I'm Professor Joel Garibarf. I'm an Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Arizona State University. To those of you who are not familiar with the Center of Jewish Studies, let me say that we are a unique hybrid of an academic program and a research center. We serve as an intellectual resource for all aspects of the Jewish experience throughout the ages, covering diverse dimensions of the Jewish experience as it has evolved over time. Through undergraduate and graduate courses, research conferences, public lectures, and exhibits, Jewish Studies at ASU fosters critical inquiry about the past and is an invitation to be engaged in the study of those matters in the present. We believe that knowledge about Jewish culture is critical to the flourishing of Jewish life in the 21st century and to constructive relations between Jews and non-Jews as well. Our program contributes to the quality of Jewish life in the metropolitan Phoenix area and enhances Jewish studies around the world. The COVID-19 pandemic has compelled all academic units to offer programs virtually rather than in person. But if you have participated in our previous activities this year, you know that these online programs are most beneficial to larger audiences than would be able to attend were we to only be doing in-person programs. This evening, as well as next Tuesday, April 20th, we continue the reflection on the state of Jewish studies today. Let me share a few words about the history and goals of Jewish studies as an academic discipline. Jewish studies began in the 1820s, in fact, in the 18 teens in Germany, in a movement called the Wissenschaft des Judentum, the scientific study of Judaism. From the start of the academic study of Judaism, it was part and parcel of the Jewish struggle for emancipation and to foster and achieve legal and economic equality, to overcome disabilities, social marginalization and exclusion, periodic violence, and persecution. The struggle for emancipation lasted about a century, roughly from the time of the French Revolution in 1789 until the unification of Germany in 1870, at least as those matters played out in the West, in Western Europe. Eastern Europe would be an entirely different question as well. But even there, it was an uneven and incomplete process. The emergence of Jewish studies as an academic discipline signified the demand for the inclusion of Jews in society and in culture on the assumption that Jews are no different from non-Jews and that the Jewish past should be understood with the same academic tools that were applied to any other subject. To study Judaism academically or scientifically meant that the Jewish past must be studied historically and philologically in a disinterested or objective way. Judaism became a subject of scientific interpretation, and that included the canonical texts of Judaism, which Jews often took to be divinely revealed or at least divinely inspired. The Bible, the Mishnah, the Talmud, rabbinic midrashim were all texts that could now be examined and analyzed with the scientific tools of history and philology. But if so, can those texts be treated as divinely revealed or divinely inspired or as authoritative for the definition of how Jews should understand themselves and how they ought to live? That was the primary question that Jewish scholars in the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century sought to answer. Today, over 200 years after the establishment of the discipline of Jewish studies, this question does not drive the academic study of Judaism. Today, different questions take center stage. These include, why should we care about Jewish studies? To whom does Jewish studies matter? How does the academic study of Judaism contribute to Jewish life? This program is the second, as mentioned already, of a three-part series that focuses on the study of Judaism, and tonight's program focuses on Judaism in the Middle Ages and the early modern period. Next Tuesday, April 20th, we'll focus on modern and contemporary developments on Judaism and with regard to Jews. For our program this evening, we will focus on the question, what are the new ways that scholars today engage Jewish texts from the medieval and early modern periods, and why do they matter for Jews and non-Jews? We have two participants this evening. Our first is Professor Chava T. Roach Samuelson. She is the Regents Professor of History and the Irving and Miriam Lowe Professor of Modern Judaism, and also is the Director for the Center of Jewish Studies at ASU. She holds a PhD from the Hebrew University in Jewish philosophy and Kabbalah. And her first book, Between Worlds, The Life and Thought of David ben Yehuda Messer Leon, was awarded by the Institute for Jewish Studies at the Hebrew University as the best work in Jewish history, published in 1991. She writes on Jewish intellectual history, especially the interplay of Jewish philosophy and mysticism, on religion and science and technology, and on religion and ecology. Among her books, beyond the one already mentioned, are Happiness in Pre-Modern Judaism, Knowledge, Virtue, and Well-Being, Religion and Environment, The Case of Judaism, and edited volumes including Women and Gender in Jewish Philosophy, The Legacy of Hans Jonas, Judaism and the Phenomenon of Life, and The Enduring Legacy of Solo Whitmer Barone. She is also the editor of the Library of Contemporary Jewish Philosophy that appeared from 2013 to 2018, a set of 21 volumes that analyzes and focuses upon outstanding Jewish thinkers who reflect on the main intellectual and spiritual challenges that face Jewish life and Jews today, and on the future of Jewish philosophy in particular. Our second presenter is Dr. Staley Mervis. He is the Grossman Chair in Jewish Studies at Arizona State University, and is Assistant Professor of History in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies. His research and teaching focuses on dimensions of the social historical Jewish experience of early modernity, particularly within the culture of the Atlantic world. He is the author of The Jews of 18th Century Jamaica, a testamentary history of the diaspora tradition that appeared last year by Yale University Press. He is presently writing about the legal and experiential entanglement of Jews and the free people of color. Our presenters will be in the in reverse of the order in which I present them. I introduce them. Professor Mervis will speak first for approximately 30 minutes, followed by Professor Tiro Samuelson, who will speak an additional 30 minutes as well. You are welcome to post questions at any time to the Q&A function that is at the bottom of your screen. And after the conclusion of both presentations, we will have time for questions directly from the audience itself. My pleasure then to turn the mic over to Professor Mervis.
Thank you very much, Joel. I really appreciate the introduction and also just the framing in terms of 19th century scholarship. And hopefully we'll have a better sense of where we are today. But first I'm going to share my screen. Okay. I do this 20 times a day, so I should be good at it now. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Stan, can you talk louder?
Talk louder.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is my mic low?
I don't think so. I think you're just maybe a little bit far away from it.
Okay. Yeah, I could fix this. That's probably better, hopefully. Okay. So I want to address this issue of why does Jewish studies matter today and what we can learn from Jewish studies and how Judaism appears today by asking 3 questions. And I'll be presenting from the social historical perspective. I have, even though we have only 3 questions, we'll still get to have 4 cups of wine at the end. And I thought a lot about that joke before, before today, so I hope it landed well. So the first question I want to deal with is there such a thing as pre-modern pan-Jewish identity? And I'll explain why I think that matters a lot for how we identify as being Jewish today. Number 2, is pre-modern Jewish history a story of subalternity? And what I mean by subalternity or subalterity is to say, is all Jewish history, the pre-modern period, a story of disenfranchisement or a minority perspective? Or are there times when Jews are empowered or have the potential to be empowered? And number 3, I want to address the kind of myth of Jewish wealth and how Jewish communities address poverty and what that might mean for Jewish community structures today. So that's the outline of how I want to do this. Now, first, so addressing the first issue first, the idea of a pan-Jewish identity. I want to establish a case against the idea that Jews identified as being Jews. You know, the office thinks I'm dead sometimes. Golly, there we go. Okay, that might happen again. It's been happening a lot. So the case against the idea of there being pan-Jewish identity. So traditionally, we think of Jews as having an identity as being Jewish. That is to say that despite the ethnic variation, that Jews all see themselves as part of a singular people. That this is a product of modernity, or an aspect of modernity that might be dated to the 1840s when world Jewry, including in France and in England and the United States, band together to pressure governments to oppose the Damascus blood libel. Another date that sometimes gets used or thrown around is 1859, at the time of the beginnings of the unification of Italy, when a child, Edgardo Mortero, was kidnapped from his parents in Bologna and by agents of the Vatican under suspicion that he had been baptized. And this also stimulated a world Jewish response, and other events as well, anti-Jewish laws in Romania and etc. So it's usually thought of as being a modern phenomenon that Jews, despite where they lived or what their traditions were, or what ethnic variation they were, and what I mean by that is what languages they spoke or what kind of cultural aspects of Judaism they practiced, could band together and see themselves as part of a unified world Jewry. So in the early modern period, in the Middle Ages, that's a difficult case to make that Jews thought of themselves that way. So some of the issues is there were a lot more ethnic tensions, inter-ethnic tensions between Jews. When Sephardim were expelled from Spain and they go across the straits to Morocco, about 20,000 of them go to Morocco immediately after the expulsion. And they're almost immediately in conflict with Maghrebi Jews, indigenous Jews that have been there since before Islam. And so this is, the Sephardim think of themselves as being part of a superior tradition. They were the beneficiaries of Solomon ibn Gabiro, Yehuda Halevi, and all the great luminaries of Spain. And who were the Maghrebi Jews? So this is they did not see themselves as part of the same people. Another good example is when Sephardim emerge in the Ottoman world, and they're in conflict with Romaniyot, Greek-speaking Jews. And this manifests in marriage law, how to dictate divorce, what is inheritance law. There's differences in the Sephardic tradition. And then the Portuguese, especially for various reasons, which I'm happy to talk more about, really were almost obsessed with their sense of ethnic supremacy. And this meant real exclusion of Ashkenazi Jewry. You were prevented from marrying Ashkenazim. The Ashkenazim couldn't benefit from dowry lotteries and other types of social welfare. So this was these are the tensions that circulate among Jews. A really good illustration of this is the Ancona Boycott. So and this is just an interesting moment in history anyway. In 1556, 20 or so conversos showed up from Portugal, and they resided in the port town of Ancona on the Adriatic Sea. And there they reverted to Judaism. And the Counter-Reformation Pope, Paul IV, who was a reactionary figure against Judaism, had them executed for the sin of having been born Catholic as conversos and then adopting Judaism. Now, this prompted the great patron of Portuguese Jewry, Dona Gracia Nasi, who was living in Istanbul, who was really like almost like the Harriet Tubman for Jewish history. She funded a underground railroad to get Portuguese Jews out and to Italy and to the Ottoman Empire. So she tries to effect a boycott against Ancona in retribution for this. The Ottoman Sultan goes along with it and agrees to supporting this boycott. But the boycott doesn't work. And it partially doesn't work. The idea is they would move the trade to Pesaro down the coast. And it doesn't work because the Italian rabbinate doesn't agree to it. So even though Shmuel de Medina, the great rabbi of Salonika, believes that this is a proper move and it could be effective as a retribution, the famous Joshua Cincino, an important printer and exegete, says that, look, these Jews, these conversos that were killed, they're not even really Jewish. They were Catholic. Why are we going to privilege them when if you move the trade away from Ancona, then you're going to disadvantage the Italian Jews that are living there? So this was a real a point of schism. The fact that the boycott didn't work exposed the rift in these two different Jewish groups. Another good example is the controversy surrounding the Shulchan Aruch. So Yosef Caro, who was a Spanish mystic living in Sfat, he wrote this codification of Jewish law. And it was a messianic mission. He meant to do it in an effort to try to unify world Jewry under one single practice, with a goal of maybe hastening the messianic redemption. And it was not agreed upon. Immediately, it was rejected. And Moshe Isserles, the great rabbi of Krakow, inserted his own traditions, the Polish traditions, and he hoped to speak for all of Ashkenazi Jewry, but he, in turn, was rejected by Solomon Luria, the kind of spokesperson representative for German Jewry. So even among Ashkenazi, they couldn't agree on what would be the law. And so this was a failed attempt at unity and exposed, again, the rifts. And another really great study, Deborah Kaplan, who's a great scholar, a couple of years ago wrote a really important investigation of the memory book the Zifro note of Asher Alevi of Reichshofen, who lived at the time of the 30 Years' War. And she studies his identity, and she finds that there's like these concentric circles of his identity. There's his self, there's his identity within a family, there's his identity within Alsatian Jewry, then there's his identity as maybe part of a world of Ashkenaz, but nowhere in his mentality does it ever enter that he is a member of the Jewish people. See, these are all the kind of cases that people make in order to argue that pan-Jewish identity is some kind of modernity. But here's the, but I think that one of the ways or places that where the field is moving is to challenge this idea and maybe try to push the idea of pan-Jewish identity earlier. And one of the ways that's being done is in medieval studies, they're really breaking down the barriers between Sepharad and Ashkenaz. And like people like Gershom Cohen and Yitzchak Ber, like older generation scholars, really saw these as completely hermetically sealed entities. And lately, with the works of David Malkiel and Jonathan Dechter and others, we're starting to see there was actually a lot more interaction and exchange across the Pyrenees from northern France between the Tosafists and the scholars of Spain. A good example is these letters that Jonathan Dechter talks about between Rabbeinu Tam, the casuist Tosafist in northern France, who wrote communications with Ibn Ezra, Avram Ibn Ezra, the exegete and poet. And so these are people that were believed to be of two completely different worlds, but in fact, they communicated and had a mutual respect. And another good example is the idea of martyrdom that was believed to be a complete monopoly of Ashkenazim as a product of the First Crusade. And that Sephardim didn't have this kind of martyr mentality. And that was rejected by David Malkiel recently when he studied the pogroms of 1391 and found that, about 1/3 of the Jewish community did accept martyrdom and that there was a Sephardi martyrdom mentality. So this is all helpful to try to think of Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jewry not as being these two diametrically opposed things, but two ethnic communities that are in dialogue and exchange with each other. Another really good area where these walls are breaking down is a recent study by Matthias Lehmann, who argued that the emissaries from the Holy Land these were rabbinic figures who were dispatched by the Jewish regions in Istanbul to go on fundraising missions throughout Europe and also throughout the Safavid world in Persia and also into the Americas, so in North Africa as well. So these people from the Holy Land would really travel the whole Jewish world collecting funds. And Lehman argues that their arrival in these far-flung places helped to create at least the illusion of a Jewish solidarity that coalesced around the idea of the land of Israel and the authority of the land of Israel. And it's a compelling argument. And another recent argument that was made is that the catalyst for pan-Jewish identity in the early modern period was around the Talmudic requirement of Pidyon Shavuim, the idea that you were required to redeem your captives. Now, this is something that medieval kings often employed in order to extort funds from Jewish communities. Even the great Alfonso X used this method of imprisoning Jews and then extorting ransom. But in a really interesting case in the early modern period, in the wake of the Khmelnytsky massacres in 1648, 1649, which was a Ukrainian response to Polish imperialism in the Ukraine, along with the Jewish leaseholders who were involved in the landholding of the Polish. And so the nationalist figure of independence for Ukraine, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, targeted the Jews in his war against the Polish imperialism. So this resulted in a terrible moment of murder and rape and other war crimes against the Jews of the Ukraine. And one of the events that took place were Tartars who were the descendants of Mongols in Ukraine, who had converted to Islam. So they were Islamic people living in Ukraine who were there since the Mongols had captured Kiev in the 13th century. And they sold some of these Jewish captives into slavery in the black market, the Black Sea market of the slave trafficking into Istanbul. And they were purchased by the Sephardi community there, by the Ladino-speaking Sephardi community who paid the equivalent today would be millions of dollars to redeem these Ashkenazi captives from Poland. What did they care, right? Why? What connection did they have? So Adam Teller tries to make an argument that this is an indication of the beginnings of maybe a pan-Jewish identity, but particularly surrounding the requirement of Pidyon Shvuim. Okay, there we go. Now let me address the situation number 2, the idea of Jewish subalternity. So this matters for us a lot today because there's a rise in anti-Semitism and there's sort of a rebirth of the lacrimose narrative. So when Joel was talking about the earliest generation of scholars, like Heinrich Gretz, they tended to see the Jewish experience as this kind of trail of tears that leads inevitably. I mean, he lived before the Holocaust, but especially at the time of the Holocaust, that was sort of a teleological inevitability. That look at the Khmelnytsky massacres, the massacre in 1390 and 1066 and 1096, all of the massacres against Jews, it leads inevitably to this very sad march to Auschwitz. And so Sela Baron challenged that ideology and wanted to promote an anti-lacrimose history which doesn't say that there wasn't tragedy or persecution, but tries to focus more on the religious and social and cultural heritage of the Jewish people and their interactions with their neighboring societies. And I think one of the most powerful parts of the anti-lacrimose narrative is to maybe challenge the idea that Jews are always a subaltern within the places that they live. Are Jews always a persecuted minority? And that really, I think, shapes our identity today, because today Jews are empowered through the state of Israel, right? Jews have their own military, their own government. And so having the state of Israel, casts a shadow on the past. To what extent were Jews in the past empowered? So on the most basic level, one thing that's clear is Jews always had political representation to the places that they lived, probably more so than any other minority communities. And some of the examples, of course, are like the Exilarchate, the Reish Galuta in Babylonia, which was the largest Jewish community by far in the medieval world, and Iraq, what the Jews called Babylonia. He was a descendant, or he claimed to be a descendant of the house of David, which made him a messianic claimant. And the office was sustained by Umar when he conquered the Persian world, even though it was an office that was established by the Sasanian Persians earlier on. Nagidim are political emissaries that usually are tax collectors for the Yizya on Islamic lands, but they are political intermediaries that also represent Jewish interests to the Caliph. Rab de la Court are rabbis that are parts of the Eudaria, these kind of royal citadels where Jews live in Aragon and Castile. And they are also, and so this is the Christian world, and Jews have intermediaries. Stadtlanut in the time of the Reformation, and especially the famous Stadtland, Yossel of Rosheim, who really stated the case of the Jews to the Holy Roman Emperor. And also in the 18th century, you see that there's a very vibrant transatlantic Jewish lobby against Jewish disabilities that transcend, that occur both in Amsterdam and in London and in the Caribbean or wherever. And here, so that's kind of a simple level, but it gets deeper. In the Middle Ages, I argue, and you could agree or disagree, and it's a point that we can discuss, but I don't think it's inevitable in the Middle Ages that Jews wouldn't be empowered with their own state and their own army. That wasn't an inevitability yet. So some examples: in the 4th century through the 6th century, for 200 years, the Himyarite kingdom in southern Yemen was a Jewish kingdom that observed Judaism. They minted coins with Moses on them, with the word Moses. And they ultimately fell because of their conflict with Ethiopians, Christian Ethiopians across the Red Sea. So here was a completely politically enfranchised Jewish kingdom in Yemen. And if we move a little further, the Galilean soldiers in the time of the Heraclius' war between the Sasanian Zoroastrians and the Byzantine Christians, the Jews in the Galilee, which was the major locus of their residency in the Levant, were very much empowered. They had Jewish legions. They came into support of the Persians, and they were used by Persians as a military corps. And Nehemiah ben Hushiel, who was a kind of messiah himself, at least according to the Sefer Zerubbabel, he was a possible messiah. He led his own campaigns to destroy churches. They destroyed the church in Tyre in Lebanon. They supposedly destroyed churches in Jerusalem when they occupied it. And Sharbaraz, the Persian general, made him the governor of Jerusalem for a short time. So this was political empowerment. The Jewish tribes of Medina that are signatories to the Constitution of Medina, they are politically enfranchised. They defy Muhammad at the Battle of the Trench. They defy Muhammad again at the Battle of Garibarf, which are events that are very well attested to within the Hadith or the Sirah, really. And another thing, before the spread of Islam in North Africa, Jews were very successful missionaries of Berber tribes in the Maghreb. So there had been several Berber communities that adopted Judaism in the 7th century before Islam emerged. And then the big story is in the Volga River region, north of the Caspian Sea, on the borderlands between Kazakhstan and Russia, where a community in the 10th century of Turkic people called the Khazars, who had established a fur trading city of Atil on the Volga River, which doesn't exist anymore. And they accepted Judaism. And they did that in defiance of missionaries that were coming from both the Byzantine world and the Abbasid world, trying to assert either Christianity or Islam. And so this was a real moment of political empowerment. It's not inevitable that Jews wouldn't be politically empowered. Now, it's a little bit harder to make that case when you get to the early modern period. But I think in the early modern period, we can start to talk about autonomy. And there were some situations and settlements in which Jews had almost complete autonomy and self-rule. One of the most profound cases is Livorno, which is what the Ottomans called Leghorn. It was a kind of a curated city on the Tyrrhenian side of Italy that was established by the Medici as a trading port, and they needed trade connections, especially to Iberia, to undersell the Genoese who were connected to Iberia. So in the port of Livorno, the Medici offer an unparalleled charter called the Livornina, which not only allowed Portuguese Jews to live there as Jews, and they could be Judaized, and the kind of situation that happened in Ancona won't happen here, but they have complete autonomy over their own community. They don't feel like they're subalterns in Livorno. Yoden Savannah is probably the most interesting case. So this jungle village that Jews live in deep in the Surinamese jungle, this is a Jewish village. It's really a Jewish pauper's town. And the Portuguese regents are given complete autonomy and authority. The city is designed around a central synagogue. And really it's only bustling on the Sabbath. There's a Jewish militia that fights Maroons. It's a Jewish town in the middle of the Surinamese jungle with complete autonomy. So that really helps to challenge the idea of Jewish subalternity. And other examples. So Gershom Hundert made a really interesting case in a book that's kind of old now, I guess, that in the 18th century, Polish Jewry didn't think of themselves as minorities because they were living together in enclaves. And so the whole world was Jewish. So they never really thought of themselves as being a subaltern minority. They had a mentality of a majority community. That's what Gershom Hundert argues. And it's very compelling. And in a city like Salonika, the great Jewish metropolis, by virtue of just such high residency, the density of Jews living together in Salonika, it would be hard to live in Salonika and not think that it was a Jewish city. So are Jews always disenfranchised? Are Jews always the victims? Are Jews always the subalterns? I think that we can help to make meaning of our own position in the world today by appreciating the varieties of the Jewish experiences of the past. And this will be my last slide. I still have 8 minutes to go, I think, before I hit the 30-minute mark. And I'm going to try to do a quick So here's the myth. Jews are rich. You've heard this myth before. And it's an anti-Semitic canard, right? It's an anti-Semitic canard that's probably rooted in the High Middle Ages when the Capetian monarchy and other medieval monarchies used Jewish serfdoms. The servi camerai approached Jews as if they were their own property, and then were able then to use Jews to exact usurious interests, and then they would tax the Jews and take that interest for themselves. So Jews were pushed into moneyed businesses by virtue of the needs of monarchies, not because of what Jews do indigenously, or they're actually, or it's actually very distant from the Talmudic system of economy that exists. So obviously it's anti-Semitic canard, but the Jews also promote this idea themselves, and they use it to leverage their positions, especially in the early modern period. Simone Luzzatto in Venice, to try to prevent a potential expulsion in 1638, he writes this treatise to the Republic of Venice, saying that, look, Jews are wealthy and they're part of a trade network and they have no loyalty to any other place, and so their profits remain here. So basically internalizing the anti-Semitic ideology that Jews have no loyalty to states, but only to profit, but to leverage a better position. And then Menashe ben Israel makes this almost the exact same argument, but also married with messianic arguments when he was trying to negotiate the readmission of Jews to England in 1655. But David Nasi in Suriname, he writes a historical essay, and there he really he portrays the Jews as being rich merchants. But in reality, Yoden Savannah was dirt poor. It was poor. The people who lived there were dramatically poor. And so he created this fiction because he wanted to show the Dutch government that they were useful citizens. So Jews perpetuate the myth of the wealthy merchant themselves. And there are some moments when Jews have crushing poverty in Middle Ages and early modern period. There are about 20,000 refugees from Spain that end up in Fez. But under the Marinid dynasty, at the end of the Marinid dynasty, the Berber rulers of Morocco, Jews were forced into residency patterns in the Mela. So there wasn't any place for them to live. So they camped around the city of Fez, and something like 2,500 Jews were camped around Fez, and they starved to death. About 2,000 refugees starved, camped around Fez. In the 1650s, after the Khmelnytsky massacres, and then as a part of the Great Deluge into Poland, where the Russians and then the Swedes invade Poland, there's estimated 30,000 Ashkenazi refugees in Europe. In the 17th century, that's enormous. It's not dissimilar to like the Syrian refugee crisis that we see now. Maybe not quite that much, but 30,000 in the 17th century is a major refugee crisis. And Jews that are leaving Iberia to re-Judaize, or the conversos that leave, usually leave without anything, because the Inquisition co-opts your wealth. And so unless you had the foresight of smuggling your wealth through Antwerp or some places like some do, like the Lopez Suazo and the rich guys, then then you can manage. But most people show up penniless. So people who show up penniless in the 1720s, the London community sends them on to Savannah, and their Savannahs made up of a whole community of social welfare recipients. So I think that this is really helpful for us to think today, because what Jewish community means today often is connected to social welfare infrastructures. There's such a robust network of federations and of the low interest or the interest-free loan societies, the Jewish loan societies. And a lot of the identity of being Jewish now in the 21st century is related to social gospel and support of immigration. So I think looking at how Jewish communities structured social welfare in the early modern period in the Middle Ages really helps us to understand what Jewish community looks like today. So I think that there's a lot that we could really glean from the medieval and early modern experience to help us to understand our identity as being Jewish, and how unique the fact that today we do have a pan-Jewish identity, or how unique it is today that we're empowered through the state of Israel. That is, that there's a military and that there's a government. And is that unique, or is that not unique to the Jewish experience? and the fact that our community is built around social welfare, and Jews have always been dealing with this situation. So that's what I have to offer, some humble social historical approaches to this issue. And I will turn it over now to Chava. I'll stop the share.
Okay, thank you, Stanley, and thank you, Joel, for the introduction. Let me try to share my screen, and Lisa, I may need your help here. No, I'm not doing
Yeah,
it.
okay, you are. You just go down to the bottom where the PowerPoint logo is.
Yeah,
Yep, click on that.
okay. And then we can just
And then,
use the cursor to move it.
yeah.
Okay, so here we go. I can, as you realize, we are covering a very long period, basically from 500 to 1800, roughly, that's 1300 years. And I like the fact also that Stanley referred to it as the pre-modern, that glosses over the differences between the medieval and the early modern, but it's good enough for us. So I will focus on pre-modern Judaism, not so much on Jewish social life. And particularly, I'm going to tell you, I will try to tease out some of the changes in the study of Kabbalah. So I will begin by saying a few words about pre-modern Judaism and highlight creative diversity. I will then speak about Kabbalah and the academic study of Judaism. And the last part would be new perspectives in the study of Kabbalah. So just keep in mind, the first point I want to share with you is that it's very important to realize that the medieval period and the early modern period were highly creative. And I list for you the various I would call them avenues of Jewish creativity. And it's absolutely mind-boggling. And that's true both for the medieval and for the early modern. So you have biblical exegesis, namely commentaries on the Bible. You have, of course, a lot of work in halakha, in Jewish law and jurisprudence. You have commentaries on the Talmud, you have glosses on the Talmud, you have dictionaries of the Talmud, you have codes of Jewish law. So jurisprudence is a very important theme in Jewish intellectual life. Midrash, or the homiletical tradition, continues through the Middle Ages and the early modern period, and it also moves it's not just among the intellectuals, it's also in the synagogues. That's the purpose of the sermons, of the drashot. Already in the Middle Ages, we have how do you unpack the biblical text? You have to do it through understanding the grammar of the Hebrew language, and you have to develop theories, linguistic theories that explain how grammar works. That in and of itself is an important development in the Middle Ages. Poetry and poetics. And by poetry, I refer both to secular poetry, namely poetry that was outside of the synagogue, poetry that talked about women, about wine, about love, about death, about, what does it mean to be a human being? And there's also a theory of poetry, namely poetics. We also have liturgical poetry that was developed in the Middle Ages, namely poetry that was used in the synagogue and was composed for the synagogue service. We have prose literature. We have beautiful texts that most Jews actually today are not familiar with, but wonderful prose literature, actually rhymed prose that has poetry embedded in it, that was developed in the 14th and 15th centuries, really gorgeous stuff. And all I'm trying to convey to you, that Jews can express themselves in a variety of genres. Philosophy, of course, is very important, and philosophy goes together with a whole range of sciences. The queen of the sciences is considered theology. So Jews develop systematic theology as well as dogmatics, namely what are the dogmas of Judaism and what should Jews believe. We have books to that effect as well. Ethics, of course, is very important, and ethics in the Middle Ages is part of political theory. And finally, the focus of my talk, which will be Kabbalah and the mystical tradition broadly understood. So the main point here is I want to give you a sense of how diverse, how creative the Jewish intellectual was in the pre-modern period. The Jewish intellectual, even when the Jewish intellectual wrote about the sciences, he was, and it was he was a religiously committed Jew. All activities, even activities that we would consider secular, were actually understood religiously. Here we may have a disagreement between me and Stanley. We'll see how it goes, but that's my view, that religion really envelops and encompasses all aspects of life in the pre-modern period. The Jewish intellectual is an interdisciplinary scholar, is a multilingual scholar, is extremely informed about non-Jewish culture, and is able to engage non-Jews even on their terms and deal with, for example, Christian theology. Of course, in the Islamic world, it's even more so. The Jewish intellectual is a highly creative interpreter of canonic texts. Philosophy, of course, is one of the major avenues, as already indicated. So he knows the Jewish intellectual is competent in several sciences, not just one. And I find that kind of richness, of intellectual richness, as something to keep in mind. So there's a lot to know about the Middle Ages. I will, and a lot to be, in a sense, a lot to be proud of the Middle Ages, but I will, Middle Ages and the early modern period, but I will choose only one particular theme, and that's the Jewish Kabbalistic tradition, to tell you a little bit how it all fits into the study of Judaism. So I'm moving now to discussion of the study of Kabbalah. And here the interesting thing is that Kabbalah played an important role in the history of Jewish studies. If you want to get a handle on how Jewish studies changed over 2 centuries of existence and what is novel about Jewish studies today, I think we should look at Kabbalah much more than other venues such as halakha or philosophy. So Jewish studies, as we already heard from Joel, emerged as a discipline in the early 19th century. And it's a development of the Haskalah movement, of the Jewish Enlightenment movement. But I have to remind you that the Maskilim, the promoters of the Haskalah, were very unhappy and uncomfortable with Kabbalah. They were particularly uncomfortable and even disdainful of Sefer HaZohar, which is the major Kabbalistic text. I will say more about that in a minute. While the Zohar presented itself as a rabbinic text composed by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in the 2nd century, the Maskilim used the tools of historical research to show that this could not have been possible. So the Zohar must be a medieval text rather than a rabbinic text. And as such, it should not be taken as authoritative or canonic text. So the Haskalah movement generated the Society for the Academic Study of Judaism that was created in 1819. So it's exactly 200 years ago. And the founders of the academic study of Judaism, people like Marcus Jost, Leopold Zunz, Heinrich Gretz, who is the person that we'll say a few words about momentarily, all felt that Kabbalah was an intellectual embarrassment because Kabbalah was irrational fantasy. It was highly particularistic rather than universal. It was too enmeshed in the practice of magic rather than with philosophy and science. And because Kabbalah was the foundation of Hasidism, the movement that the Maskilim opposed, they really couldn't stand anything that had to do with Kabbalah. So from the perspective of the 19th century, the Jewish historians of the 19th century, Kabbalah was a superstition. It was a harmful superstition. If Judaism is to become respectable and worthy of inclusion in European culture, Jews would have to give up their allegiance to Kabbalah and its practices. And those practices included exorcism of spirit, use of amulets and incantations to alleviate pain or sickness, or to help with childbirth. It included even reading, I'm sorry about that, but I cannot do anything about this call coming in, so we'll just ignore it. Basically, they could not stand anything to do with Kabbalah. So the example that we have here is Heinrich Gretz, who was already mentioned. And he's a typical person, a typical Jewish historian who wanted to dismiss Kabbalah. He's especially upset about the Zohar. And the Zohar for him is basically a forgery. For Heinrich Gretz, there was no difference between a forgery, namely something that you're doing with the intent of deceiving people, and what we call pseudepigrapha, also in kind of writing under an assumed name. For him, it was the same thing. So this person who wrote the almost, I would say, classic text about Jewish history, the history of the Jews, that's a 6 volumes project that you have here. He is very, very uncomfortable about Kabbalah, and he's not alone. The bottom line is that if Jewish studies means modernization and rationalism and science and social progress, then Kabbalah had to either be exposed for what it is, such as a forgery or fraudulent or something detrimental to the Jewish people. Okay, so that's the dominant approach to Kabbalah in the beginning of Jewish studies. Now we go to the next person. We go to the next person in the story, and that's, I don't know if you can see the full picture of Gershom Scholem, but the next person in the story is Gershom Scholem, who clearly was the founder of the academic study of Kabbalah. And Gershom Scholem positions himself against Gretz and against everything that Gretz believed in. And that's the integration of Jews into European society. So Gershom Scholem says, no, there's something profoundly wrong about that belief that Judaism and German culture couldn't be in a symbiosis with each other. And he adopts, rather young, he was still relatively young, he adopts Zionism as his commitment or his way in the world. He departs from Germany, 1923, goes to Palestine, and he is among the founders of the Hebrew University, which was founded in 1925. And Gershom Scholem created the academic study of Kabbalah. And he wrote this book, The Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, is a book that appeared in the middle of World War II, which is again an interesting story. Gershom Scholem actually told us or created the structure of the study of Kabbalah. So he wrote about the text, he wrote about the main personalities, he wrote about the historical development of Kabbalah. But what's interesting about the way he presented Kabbalah is that for him, Kabbalah was a way to make Zionism a successful project. Can you imagine, how do you combine Zionism and Kabbalah? But that's exactly what he believed should be done. Why? Because for him, Kabbalah had this messianic energy, if you want to call it, or messianic impulse. And Zionism was the last variant or the last version of this messianic impulse, which started actually with Luriani Kabbalah right after the expulsion from Spain. So Scholem gives us a story from the expulsion of Spain, 1492, all the way to Zionism. And it's all developing in kind of a Hegelian way from one dialectical development to the next. And clearly for him, that's the way to become truly Zionist with the national culture in Hebraic national culture in Israel. All this will have to happen through the study of Kabbalah. So I cannot tell you how powerful Scholem was until he passed away in 1982. But he really controlled the Hebrew University during the 50s and this even before 40s, 50s, 60s. When I came to the Hebrew University in 1971, he was already retired. I studied with his proteges, with his students. But the assumption was that you don't have to be you don't have to be a religious Jew to study Kabbalah. Anybody could study Kabbalah if you know Hebrew and if you learn the relevant texts. And Kabbalah has to be understood as part of the national culture of the Jews. So being a Zionist, kind of being a product of Zionism, it's hard for me to think that Zionism created the concept of a Jewish people, but maybe Stanley is precisely right, that in the Middle Ages, there wasn't one concept of Jewish people. We can argue about that actually, but clearly the study of Kabbalah was beginning to flourish, especially in the early 70s. Now, Sholem gave us the major structures of that field. Who is studying the field? Well, in the early 70s, a lot of Jews in America are discovering Kabbalah. Remember the emergence of New Age spirituality in the late 60s and early 70s. A lot of people find Kabbalah the solution to their spiritual quest. Many of them come to Israel to study at the Hebrew University. Some of the great scholars of Kabbalah today actually are Jews, American Jews who came to Israel, studied the Hebrew University, and came to America. So the bottom line, Kabbalah, the study of Kabbalah begins to take off. And the next person in the story is Moshe Idel. Moshe Idel, not too long after Sholem died, Sholem passed away in 1982. By 1988, already Moshe Idel really goes against practically everything that Sholem said. So Moshe Idel revolutionizes the study of Kabbalah and tells everybody, you know, you should not study Kabbalah as Sholem told us to do it, namely historically and philologically and developmentally. You have to look at paradigms, you have to look at phenomenological paradigms that explain religious experiences. So he claims that Kabbalah has two main paradigms, the theosophic theurgic, namely you have to know about God in order to influence God, and prophetic ecstatic, which means that you have to envision God, and through ecstatic experience, you can come to unify yourself with God. So there is mysticism in Judaism, which is not the way Sholem understood it. So Sholem actually diminished the importance of mysticism. And Dale says, no, Kabbalah is all about unifying or communion, intimacy with God. And therefore, he's going to put the focus on different people. For example, on Abraham Abulafia, it was very important to the way Idel told the story of Kabbalah, but really marginal for Sholem. So Idel gives us a whole new way of looking at Kabbalah, more comparatively, more phenomenologically, focusing on the experience. He also tells us that we have to pay attention not just to what happened in Lurianic Kabbalah, we have to pay attention to Italy. What happened in Italy? Kabbalah became very influential in Italy. Kabbalah impacted many Christians. So that's what we need to understand. That's what we need to study. And he really shifts the entire way of going about the understanding of Kabbalah. So again, if you at the end of the here, if you look at the bottom of the of that particular slide, you'll see that Idel also told us to think differently about Hasidism, and he suggested that Hasidism was really a combination of ecstatic Kabbalah, that's the Kabbalah of Abulafia, and interest in magic. That's very different from the way that Sholem told us to think about Kabbalah. So now we are now in the beginning of in the 90s, in the mid-90s, there is a real kind of a growth of the study of Kabbalah, academically speaking. And a lot of people are moving into this field, both in Israel and the United States. In the United States, the major scholar of Kabbalah is Elliot Wolfson. And what he's doing, he's building on both Sholem and Idel, but he's moving it forward, utilizing the richness of the humanities, especially religious studies. I have to say that Idel does that as well, but with Elliot Wolfson, you get much more into philosophy, much more into religious studies, much more into especially postmodern development in contemporary philosophy. And you have Kabbalah that is more subtle, more poetic, more interior. It's really quite complex, I have to say. But between there is a dispute about how to interpret major issues in Kabbalah. For example, they disagree about how to interpret gender in Kabbalah. I'll tell you more about gender in a second. How to understand the messianic dimension of, especially of Hasidism, how to interpret the impact of philosophy on Kabbalah and the impact of Kabbalah on European philosophy. All those issues are highly debatable, but it's only to give you a sense of how rich contemporary scholarship on Kabbalah is. So here are some of the terms that I would like to briefly explore with you. I have a few minutes. I have about 10 more minutes. I'll try to go through them just to give you a taste of the richness of Kabbalah. So I'm going to speak about the linguistic turn, how Kabbalah really is connected or understood deeply the power of language. The literary turn or the artistic turn, Kabbalah is really understood as an art rather than a systematic philosophy or theosophy even. There is a social development, a social turn. Kabbalah should be understood as a communal practice and not just as the work of individuals. There's an affective, namely emotional. The affective turn, Kabbalah is kind of understood as a psychological force to describe the interior life. There's the gender turn, because today you cannot be in the humanities without thinking about gender and women. So how Kabbalah understood the feminine dimension, or how Kabbalah is understood in relationship to the feminine dimension of God. And finally, the ecological turn. So this is, I'm going to give you in each slide a few references to a few texts that are relevant here. And this is really just the tip of the iceberg. And I want to impress on you the need to realize how much scholarship is going on in the last 3 decades, especially since the 90s on. So there's a real boom here. So as far as the linguistic turn, the idea here is the Kabbalistic idea, which I cannot explain to you, but maybe if one time we will have a general course about Kabbalah, I'll be glad to do it. Kabbalah really understands the world as a linguistic construct. The world was created by language, through language, and by language, I'm talking about the Hebrew language, and the Hebrew letters are the building blocks of the universe. So Kabbalah gives us what I like to call the grammar of reality, the grammar of the world. And if you know that grammar, then you can develop, you can impact the world and what we call engage in magic, and you can even impact God, because God is out of the same, in a sense, out of the same, shall we call it, infinite light that ultimately gives us the world. There's a connection between light and the Hebrew letters. Again, we can't unpack all this now, but the point is that the linguistic turn, which was very important also in the humanities during the 1990s, in Kabbalah means something very specific. So since the world was created through language, Kabbalah seeks to explicate the grammar. So you can think about Kabbalah as an information theory. That's one way of understanding what's going on here. Kabbalah also is closely related to magic, the ability to manipulate the world through verbal formulas. And Kabbalah can even impact God, and we call that in the technical language theurgy. Since the world is a linguistic construct, you can look at the Kabbalist as artists. And I really think that if you think in that, if you look at it in that, from that perspective, you can look at the Kabbalists as those people engaged in the performance of the art we call Judaism. And that leads me to the next, the literary turn or the artistic turn. There's a lot of attention today to look at the major text of Kabbalah as literary text, and that's especially true about Sefer HaZohar. Sefer HaZohar, which is the key text of Kabbalah, it was created not in the 2nd century, but in the 13th century. And today what scholars do is to tell us that it's not a book, but an anthology of books. It's a product of a group, a mystical fraternity in Castile. And this is a very artistic, imaginative, fantastic literature that is close in style to what we call magic realism. That's the work. The person that you really want to take a look at is Eitan Fishbein's new book, The Art of Mystical Narrative, The Poetics of the Zohar. It's a beautiful argument about the richness, the artistic richness of the Zohar. So the more scholars look at it as a literary text, they also have to explain how it came about and what's unique about that text. When you go to the social turn, we look at Kabbalah as a social reality. The focus here is primarily of the mystical fraternities in Tzfat, in Safed, in the 16th century. And here there's a lot of awareness of the complex relationship between the leader and the people around him. All the Kabbalistic literature that articulated very sophisticated theories are actually theories that ultimately pertain to this, to the human soul and its genealogy. So we know an awful lot about the relationship between the individuals, but also the intense atmosphere at the time of this group. Sorry, I skipped one. So now those who write about, especially about Luriani Kabbalah in 16th century, they tell us how unique that place was. And psychologically, this was a very intense place. People felt that they're constantly communing with the spirits of the dead. Spirit possession was a very common phenomenon in Tzfat. Sense of sinfulness and negative emotions like envy and anger and so forth were admitted and had to be dealt with. And this community is obsessed with pursuit of religious perfection through the cultivation of virtues. So psychologically, there's enormous range and enormous depth in Kabbalah, and people today are dealing with it as much more straightforward way than in the past. They don't try to minimize it or get rid of it, but rather to accept it. As far as the gender turn is concerned, of course, we are all much more attentive to the complexity of gender, the fact that you cannot understand any society without women, but how to interpret Kabbalah on gender is a highly debated issue. Kabbalah looks at God as an androgynous deity, but what does that mean? It means that God has a male and female dimensions, but what exactly is that femininity or masculinity? Scholars, especially Dell and Wolfson, are not in agreement on the interpretation of it. But more as women got more and more into the study of Kabbalah, many scholars of Kabbalah today are women, myself included. They paid more attention to how women experienced Kabbalah, how they contributed. Women did have mystical experiences. Women were involved in phenomena such as trance and spirits possession. So you have to look at women as well. By way, I'm moving toward the end. The transition from the pre-modern to the modern pertain to Hasidism. There's a lot of new research now on Hasidism. If you only want to get one book on Hasidism, I highly recommend David Beale, Hasidism New History. It's a marvelous collection of huge book, but it's a very, very important collection of all the scholarship that has accumulated in the last few decades. So as far as the study of Kabbalah today is concerned, Kabbalah studies as part of the humanities. Increasingly, the social sciences are applied to the study of Kabbalah, for example, folklore studies or sociology or psychology. The academic study of Kabbalah also is very much part of contemporary Jewish life. You cannot understand the Jewish renewal movement without the contribution of scholars of Kabbalah. And Neo-Hasidism today undergirds the Jewish environmental spirituality. This is why I mentioned one of the turns is the ecological turns, and how Jewish environmental spirituality really draws its not just inspiration, but it's understanding of the world from Kabbalah and Hasidism. So my conclusion to you is that the academic study of Judaism ensures the future of Judaism. The academic study of Kabbalah impacts life outside of the academy. And of course, everything we do in the academy is informed by and is related to processes outside of the academy. But there's a lot of richness, much more richness in the study of Kabbalah than in the study of Jewish philosophy. So that's what we try to do at ASU when we try to introduce our students, not so much to Kabbalah, that's very hard to teach, although I've done it twice, but that's harder to teach than other aspects of the Jewish experience or the Jewish literary experience. But the point is to bring students both at ASU and in the community at large to appreciate and value the complexity and richness of the medieval and early modern periods. So with that in mind, we can now take some questions, and I hope you find it useful. So Lisa, let's stop share the text and we can now take questions.
Perfect. This is for Stan. What was the origin of the Jewish town hall in Prague? Did the Jews report directly to the Austro-Hungarian emperor?
Unmute. Okay, sorry. Can you repeat the question about Prague? Was the
Sure. It was about Prague. What was the origin of the Jewish town hall in Prague? Did the Jews report directly to the Austro-Hungarian emperor?
that's a good question. I'm not sure I know.
You don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that you know, there's a story to tell in Prague. I mean, Prague had a huge Jewish community in the 16th century, great rabbinic leadership, their involvement in science, David Gans. And the town hall, is this a product of the Toleranzpatent? Is that, am I thinking of the right thing? Is that what this is in reference to?
It doesn't say.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
this person wants to write in the chat any specifics, we'll try to address it. But otherwise,
yeah. Sorry.
we're just gonna go on.
As much as I like to pretend I know everything.
Also, Stanley, can you speak more about the images that you showed?
Oh yeah. So the truth is that I kind of put this PowerPoint together a little bit quickly, just because it's been a little bit of a busy week. So I apologize for that. So that's to say that the images aren't always completely connected to the topic of the slide. But I just wanted to show you some good images from the medieval, early modern, just to get a sense of the aesthetic of Jewish life in the medieval and early modern period. So some of them are gleaned from Haggadot, which are often very well illustrated. Those are the Passover Seder texts. And a lot of those survive because everyone had them. And a lot of them are really elaborately illustrated. And some of the texts are from collections of prayers that are called techinis, which is something that was for women, and they often are referred to as the Birkat Hamazon and the Kriya Shema Shel Mita. So that is to say, there are these collections of these prayers that are recited during the day, and they're really well illustrated, especially from Austrian ones. So yeah, I just tried to find some images that I thought helped to capture the feeling of the early modern and medieval period. They weren't necessarily connected to the text, and for that I apologize. I usually try to be more creative about that, but yeah.
Great, thank you. And we might have one more. Let me just double check. And yes, Hava, can you speak more about women and Kabbalah?
So the question has to be more focused, I guess. So I'm not sure what the person who asked the question would like to focus on. The truth is, to begin, Kabbalah was written by men, and it's about men, and it's for men. At least that's the point of departure. However, as I said, there is a debate about that. There's a new book by, by Moshe Del who's arguing that actually the Kabbalists privileged the feminine dimension of God, namely the Shekhinah. Everybody knows the word Shekhinah. We all use it, and we never think that the word Shekhinah, which is pre-Kabbalistic, of course, it's the presence of God, but the Shekhinah is the lowest of the 10 Sfirot, and the argument is that the Shekhinah really is the, how shall I put it, that when the Kabbalists thought about God, the Kabbalists thought about the Shekhinah and how to unite with the Shekhinah and how to have intimacy with the Shekhinah. So what's the argument here? So Idel gives us kind of a heterosexual understanding of male-female relations or masculine-feminine relations. On the other hand, Wolfson gives us a different take on the same texts and the same issues. And he says, no, Kabbalah really understood God as an androgynous male deity. So God is male with masculine and feminine qualities. But what the feminine qualities are all about, they are ultimately to be absorbed into and be included in the male. So according to Wolfson, the feminine is always subordinate to the masculine. According to Idel, the other way around. So how do you resolve that difference? I'm not going to try. I think the way my solution would be this. The Kabbalistic richness is so much beyond anything we can understand, we can encompass. No one theory can do justice to this humongous body of literature. So you can always find text for this position or for that position. And to try to argue that there's only one right position is probably not the case. That's the way I would resolve it. It's like saying Divrei Elohim Chaim, this and this is the living words of God. So both positions probably have enough textual support. Does that help you, Naomi?
It does. It's just so fascinating. So I guess I just had a question also, if you could talk more. You had mentioned these women who become, I don't know, possessed or, you know,
Yeah. You have trance experience. Actually, I have right in front of me, I have a book which I think I put in the list, but this is the book, Dibbooks and Jewish Women in Social History, Mysticism and Folklore by Rachel Elior. Women had dibbooks, but now that's an interesting issue. The dibbook is usually a male, and the act of entering into the female body is a sexual act, because the word is impregnation. So it's understood in terms of you are possessed, you are impregnated by a male spirit. And then what is exorcism? Exorcism is to take that out of your body and free the person from that possession. So spirit possession, which was very important in the early modern period, was so embarrassing to Gretz and to the Haskalah movement. But contemporary scholars are not embarrassed by it and say, okay, let's understand it. Let's understand it socially, psychologically, try to figure it out anthropologically. And it's part of the human experience. So that's why they can be much more supportive rather than judgmental as people were in the 19th century.
Great. Thank you, Hava. The next question comes from Stanley Nitzberg, who I believe is in Chicago. Hi, Stanley. This is Lisa. And this is for both of you. If you could be any Jewish scholar from the past, who would it be and why?
If I were to choose?
Yes, you get to choose.
So I have to, well, we all have our favorites, but My favorite actually is Maimonides. So it's actually the Jewish philosopher, and I didn't tell you anything about philosophy this evening. But in terms of the power, I mean, I think to a great extent that Maimonides was the greatest philosopher in the Jewish history, period. From his own day, he died in 1204, to our day. There's no way to think about Jewish philosophy without Maimonides. But that doesn't mean that I'm not respectful and appreciative of the greatness, let's say, of the people who generated the Zohar. So I can appreciate creativity in more than one place. If you have to choose a person to meet with, I would like to choose an interview with Maimonides. That would, and especially, you know, he worked in the court of the Sultan of Fatimid Egypt. I would like to do it in the court and meeting there, and you know, it would have been an interesting experience.
And maybe your HMO will cover a doctor's visit with him. Yeah, I heard the question as, what scholar would you like to be? And I usually play this game. I still do. It's like, what scholar do you want to have lunch with, right? Like, who do you want to have lunch with from the past? And so I think I have two different answers to that. I think if I had to pick somebody for the early modern period to have lunch with, it would be Leone Modena, because I just think he's just the right amount of crazy, and you know, and he'd probably have some games to play. And I just think he'd be a really fascinating character. But if I had to be a scholar, I might choose the Chida, Chaim Yosef David Azulai, because travels everywhere. He also, I think he inhabits a lot of different worlds, right? He can play the secular, he can play the religious, and I think he is able to inhabit a lot of different characteristics and to kind of be an exotic outsider. So I would probably say the Chida if I had to be somebody. Although he does spend a lot of time in quarantine, and so I mean, that'd just be kind of cycling back to where we are now.
Great, thank you.
And Joel, who are you gonna be?
Yeah, who would Joel be?
I'd like to be, in my world that I know best, I'd like to sit down with what are called the Stamim, the anonymous people who put together the Talmud as we know it, and really figure out what they were trying to accomplish there. The fascinating development of sort of hiding your own presence in a text, and yet being so definitive in terms of, last week when I spoke about it, the revolution in Talmud studies is to recognize the creativity of putting the work together. And that's done by some figures from the 5th to the 7th century who remain anonymous. So I guess they first have to come out from their incognito sense. That itself would be kind of interesting, and situate them in their time and place.
I would like to add, I don't know if you have another question, Lisa, but I would like to suggest that that very question actually indicates the relevance of the people of the past to us in the present. And the way that I have to say, that's how I feel about all philosophers and all thinkers that I studied. And I study many people who are even earlier than the Middle Ages. And my point is that you can, when you read the text, you can really see how people in antiquity, let's say, or in the Middle Ages, dealt with, in a sense, the same existential issues that we are still struggling with. So it kind of brings in the humanity of these people to us, and a text for me from the 2nd century or from the 5th century BC, let's say I think about Plato or Aristotle, that's 4th century BC. I find it as meaningful and as relevant, as contemporary as a text that was written yesterday.
I think that's the perfect conclusion to this session.
Were there other questions, Lisa? I saw a few
No.
others.
So I think I would like to, let me say before Joel, go ahead, Ariel. I see that you have a
Oh, sorry, I missed one. Let's see. Let me unmute Ariel and he can ask his question live. Just give me a second.
There we go.
Okay, Ariel.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
So yeah, I was wondering, especially given the rise in anti-Semitism, especially like, playing off of these, canards, especially like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, how might we, because I think the reason that a lot of these theories have thrived in the first place is because generally people don't even know about this side of Judaism, let alone Judaism to begin with. And a lot of that has to do with throughout the Middle Ages and into the modern period, so much information was able to be controlled, whether it was by the church or by, different kingdoms. But now with the internet, that's no longer hindered, and people are looking into the into different things. And I've personally heard a lot of people horribly misinterpret things in order to, and obviously, those people are beyond, convincing that Jews are not controlling the world. But how do we make this stuff more? I mean, obviously, someone who really wants to study it is going to study it as opposed to someone who doesn't really care. But how do we just generally make this? I mean, obviously, a lot of it's very obscure, but how do we make it, not as like imposing on people who don't understand the basic context or background of what the Kabbalah is, especially given the connection between the term Kabbalah and Kabbalah.
So I think that we need to get a better handle on the question. What exactly are you asking? Are you asking how do we make very complicated ideas, such as Kabbalistic ideas, available to the general public or accessible to the general public? Is that the question that you have in mind?
No, how do we, I mean, obviously that's the thing. It's so difficult to explain to someone who doesn't understand what it is in the first place. But like, how do we just generally make it so that, I mean, I guess that's part of the issue because of how obscure it is, even to people who are Jewish. How, like, I guess what I'm saying is, how do we combat the disinformation that's just surrounds it because of how it's been so central in the anti-Semitic canards and, like.
Yeah. Okay. I think. Okay. I think I have a handle, and maybe Staley can help as well. I think that my answer is always the same: education. I mean, that's our job. Our job is to make material accessible, knowable, understandable to people who come from lack of knowledge and sometimes, disinformation, as you call it. I'm not going to go on a blog to try to kind of unpack or tell some blogger that they misinterpret Kabbalah. That's not my job in the world. My job is to allow students like you who care and who want to know more what they need to know. And my job is to teach Jews and non-Jews how to understand this. And I agree with you, these are difficult texts. This is not easy stuff. It's hard in the case of Kabbalah because Kabbalah has been popularized. Think of Madonna, think of the whole craze in Hollywood that was generated by a place called Kabbalah Center, as a matter of fact. So there's a lot of attempt to make Kabbalah accessible to the general public, and there's a lot of misinformation about Kabbalah in that regard. But what you're talking about is the more pernicious use of Kabbalah for all sorts of reasons. It's very hard to fight, but the only thing we can do is to make it accessible through the academic scholarship. That would be my answer, even though it may not be emotionally satisfying. Stanley, what do you think?
I won't speak directly to teaching Kabbalah because, you have the world expert here. But I appreciate what you're saying, that Kabbalah is, and even coming from a religious perspective, to try, if people coming from a religious upbringing, to try to tell them that the Zohar wasn't written by Shimon Bar Yochai. That comes with that. That's the other side of this, is the challenge of speaking academically. But for me, speaking in a broader sense, to combat anti-Semitism through Jewish studies, to my mind, the worst thing you can do is try to apologize or whitewash the past, because that's kind of what Gretz was doing. And people like him, they were embarrassed by mysticism. They were embarrassed by the realities of Jewish slave ownership and other things like that. Cases where there's there are all just cases in Italy where women were accusing Jews of rape in the household. I feel like the best defense, the best way to approach it, is just to approach the Jewish people, as human beings like everybody else, with all of the same stains, but all of the same greatness. And so that's my approach, is to never shy away from any truths as far as I see them, and to embrace the complexity of Jewish people and all of the skeletons and all of the greatness.
I think that's a really good answer. And I think ultimately the best boon to this is that the internet allows anyone to find, real information if they search hard enough, whereas it used to be, it was, locked in libraries and monasteries.
Yeah, we'll be out of the job soon.
Yeah, there was a question in the chat, I believe, about what's a good book to learn about Kabbalah. What would be a good place to start, right? I believe I saw that kind of question in the chat. So the answer is, I would recommend the book by David Ariel, Kabbalah, The Mystic Quest in Judaism. That's a very good beginning introduction. It's an entry, but very well done. So that would be one. Of course, the books of Sholem, one of them is just called Kabbalah. That would be a place to start. But there are many places. I think that maybe the question suggests that we need to have a course on Kabbalah for the Jewish community, in which I'll be very glad to hold such a course and really teach people kind of the basics and how to make sense historically, intellectually, socially, of this very, very fascinating and important phenomenon. I don't believe you can understand Judaism without Kabbalah. I'll put it this way. If you ignore Kabbalah, you really ignore an important aspect of Judaism.
So if I could intrude here, sort of the end of our time, and not at all to step on Chava's toes. To the contrary, I very much appreciate having here at ASU. In the old days, when I was kind of Jewish studies, I did teach a course on Kabbalah. I taught one in the community. I would just add, I find Danny Matt's Essential Kabbalah is a very helpful book with all the footnotes. And with a good teacher, it can really begin to get a feel for how to read. He focuses on the Zohar. But I wanted to return very quickly to just Ariel's question and just say, I think the biggest issue is not to make anti-Semitism the driving force of why we want to teach Jewish studies. The goal is to represent and understand the Jews on their own terms. To be sure, you have to situate the Jews in the social political context. But and I don't mean to imply you're asking this, but how to respond to non-Jews who don't like Jews is not a very good way to. It's letting the other side define your agenda. And I think that's not very helpful at all. And in that regard, I'd just like to close our program by thanking both Chava and Stanley for their wonderful presentations, and to invite everybody to the third webinar that will take next week, take place next Tuesday, again at 7 o'clock, with other ASU colleagues speaking about the study of Jews in the modern world. I wish everybody good night, and thank you all for coming.